season.
OWS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes. We are back with another installment in the Industry Experts series. I'm going to be joined today by another OWS contributor. And since last time we talked, a whole heck of a lot has changed. I thought it would be a good time to bring him back because a whole heck of a lot is about to change again. So without further ado, let's bring him in. The man, Mr. Papy. How we doing this fine Friday morning, dude?
What's up, guys? It's beautiful here in Pittsburgh. It's like 90 degrees. I got my pickleball clothes on. That's where I'm going.
I hate you.
This afternoon, I'm going to play some sports outside. Can't wait. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my wife who defended her dissertation this morning. She's officially a doctor. So congratulations, honey. I love you.
Let's go, dude.
Big accomplishment, sweetie. Very proud of you. Anything I do here today is just your day.
Yes. Sully's in the chat. Let's go, dude. I love that. Dope shout. God damn it. Now I got to shout my wife out. I can't do it now. I can't I just keep that in mind. Damn it. You suck. First of all, you suck because the weather here in Phoenix is like 115 today. So that is great. This is the time of year where the rest of the country is laughing at us that live in Phoenix. Yeah, we get it. We got to pay for 4 months for the rest of the 8 months to be beautiful. Anyway, yeah, dude, like I talked about in the intro, the last time we talked was basically just after the draft. I mean, we had you on super early. We talked a lot about how you drafted pretty heavily in the big board, and that led to some of the stuff that you were attacking once this draft window for BBM and all the majors opened. Now we're about to, or I wanted to bring you back on now because we're about to like enter into another kind of changing of the guard or a new meta, or a lot of changes about to happen with, we have camps that are opening in like 7 days, and most of the veterans are reporting on the 25th. So 13 days from now, that's going to bring in a lot of change. So let's talk about that. What are you seeing as kind of like the way forward as we enter all this, I guess, this period of change, we'll say?
Yeah, so I actually think this is kind of the most interesting season of best ball since I've started doing it, on Best Ball Mania 2, I think was my first year. Because this year, I think we're really seeing kind of like a meta develop in the way that people are drafting, like kind of a common strategy. And I don't think we saw that really in any previous year. And it makes me wonder why that's developing more this year. And I know streamers and YouTubers and things are all kind of saying the same thing. Draft 4 receivers in the first 7 rounds, draft 1 or 0 running backs and an elite tight end and a quarterback that pairs with somebody on your team. So I know that that's what's being said out there, and obviously people are following it. But I feel like that was said in previous years. YouTube is not new. People streaming fantasy football content is not just happening this year. So what is making it so more prevalent this year to the point where like you can even see ADP being affected by it more than I think in any other year? In fact, 2 of the guys that I talked about on our podcast when we did this a month ago, that you asked me who I thought could move up in ADP, and I told you Christian Watson and Jameson Williams were the 2 people that I listed. And at the time, they were both around 90 to pick 100, and now they're both up into the 70s. And I said I thought that they were going to move up, as we just talked about, when training camp broke, and you started to get all this news, and you started to get Jameson Williams is still fast, and he was the 11th pick, and he's getting behind the safeties, and Christian Watson, they went like this, and now his hamstring, it's okay, and I was like, oh, these guys are going to move up in ADP when all this happens, when training camp comes out. And yeah, there's been a little bit of positive things about both of them. Jameson Williams, he's probably going to be the wide receiver too. We kind of already knew that. And, Christian Watson, some specialist said something about what do you expect him to say? Obviously, they're going to say they can figure it out. You know what I mean? He could still pull his hamstring the first day. But, they said that they got something, figured out for his hamstring. So there's been a little bit of positive news about them. But look how much they moved up almost 2 rounds, these guys. I mean, they went from already. Training camp didn't even happen. And so you say to yourself, like, what made a guy move up, 30 picks? And in previous seasons, it would have had to have been some type of positive news. Like either a guy got hurt around him, or, they're saying, coaches are saying he's, catching everything, and there's all these videos about it. It would have to be something like that to move a guy up 30 picks. Now it's literally just like, because they're wide receivers, and people were like, oh man, I just have to get 4 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds before pick 84. And if I don't, then I'm a donkey. So, all right, well, who's left? okay, well, it's these guys going at pick 90 or pick 100. I'm just going to draft them at pick 83 so that all my buddies online don't laugh at me and tell me I'm the rake. And so they
hits home.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it is. And so they did this, and you see these guys come up 30 picks, and now you're even seeing it with Cortland Sutton. If you draft consistently, he's the next guy. So it was like, there's even negative news about Cortland Sutton. It's like, he might hold out. He's not happy with his contract, and they have all these other receivers that have been drafted recently, and there's really no loyalty to Cortland there from Sean Payton or whatever. But you see Cortland Sutton's moved up from like pick 115 a month ago to like pick 90 now, and it's like he's creeping to 84. Like he's going to get to 84, and then he'll stop at like pick 83 because it'll be like, all right, I got him in the first 7 rounds. I did what I'm supposed to. And I think that when you see that kind of ADP movement based on just like a draft strategy, it's really not based on the players or news about the players. I don't think that's ever happened before. And so I think the change of training camp, when we talk about this big change, it's happened all these other years because we start to get real news. I'm kind of interested how that's going to impact these draft strategies. Like, what if we start to get a lot of news, which we probably will, about running back clarity? And so like a lot of running backs who right now people don't want to draft, and they're going, at pick 90 to pick 110 because we think they're in a timeshare. We don't know who the starter is. Well, when those situations start to clarify themselves, it's going to be like, okay, well, are these guys going to move up in ADP? Or is it going to be like, well, it's before pick 84. I don't know. I'm not sure. The meta is strong this year. And so I think, seeing that and thinking through that of like, okay, guys, like just because it's before pick 84 doesn't mean you have to have 4 wide receivers on your roster. You automatically lose. Maybe I should do something a little different. But I think that you're going to see ADP affected kind of in a whole different way this year when training camp breaks because of the meta.
Yeah, that's interesting to bring that up. And you keep referencing pick 84 for those that are not as math inclined. That is the end of the 7th round. Right. So when people are drafting as if I got to get 4 wide receivers in the 7th round, that is clearly going to influence the wide receivers that started ADP a couple of rounds before that, a couple of rounds after that, as we see this like consistent push for people to get the check in the box that, hey, I got 4 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds. I'm straight. It's also very interesting that this meta has kind of established itself so heavily and taken root this year, in that like we know, and I've been talking about this like since we started doing these, we know that ADP at running back historically is going to see the greatest magnitude of movements, just as a comparing position to position. And where that typically starts is at training camp, which is we're coming up on it. And we saw it for the first time. Who is it? ETR releases the weekly market update where they show ADP movers and stuff. This past week, or this week that we're in, was the first week where all the major movers, and they do like the top 5 major movers, and they show, whatever. If you're not familiar, go check it out over at ETR. Well, this was the first week where all 5 the top movers of ADPs that jumped were running backs. So like it's starting to, and they weren't like major movers. It was like 1 or 2 picks here and there. But it's starting. Like it's coming. We kind of knew this. So we've here at 1 Week Season have talked about how we need to be thinking about that back in May and June and now in July. Like we understand that this is likely going to happen. So you actually sent me a roster where you went kind of the other way with that. You went kind of against the meta, understanding that running backs were going to come up, but also goes against kind of this like, or satisfies in a different way, we'll say, this like getting 4 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds. So I'm going to pull that up and I want to talk about it a little bit. So here is the roster in question. Walk me through when this was drafted and what you were thinking about overall roster construction here.
Yeah, so this is an early draft. This was from early May. In fact, I think this is maybe my 7th or 8th draft in Best Ball Mania, and it was very shortly after we did our first podcast. And so I drafted this team, and I did this as kind of, I would say, like my anti-meta draft. I already saw sort of it forming because I did a lot of big board drafts, and then I saw that ADP, and then I kind of saw how that ADP transition. And by the way, if you're going to draft like 150 teams and draft early, I would recommend doing at least some big board drafts because it really does tune you in early.
Yeah.
I think that in my other first, years where I would do these early May drafts, I was like, I didn't really know what I was doing. In these first ones, I was just kind of feeling it out, hoping I got lucky. This year, I felt much more purposeful in my early drafts because I did a lot of big board drafts. So I would recommend that. But sidebar, this draft, I kind of saw the way that ADP was moving, right? And I saw that like nobody wants to take 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds. And then I thought even more, if anybody does take 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, it's like a mad rush for receivers right away. Like they're going to take, 4 receivers in the next 5 rounds because they have to make sure they get those 4 receivers in the first 7. And so I thought, what is going to be a type of a build that almost nobody is going to have? And I said, well, if I take 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, and then I take a quarterback and a tight end, well, I've already doomed myself to being the rake.
Yeah, you're done, dude.
I'm already the rake.
Don't post this online because
I don't even know why I'm showing this. No one's going to listen to me anymore after this. But I'm saying, okay, well, I'm already the rake. So at that point, once I do that, what type of a team, of a roster do I think I can build? And if I want to build this type of roster, I should probably do it early because ADP is the least efficient early. And if I think there'll be a lot of movement in ADP and some of these wide receivers, maybe I can actually get wide receivers on this roster early that will eventually, through ADP, end up being receivers that are top 7 round receivers. And so that was kind of my thinking. Like I have pretty good confidence that the top running backs are going to stay the top running backs. Pretty good confidence that the top QB tight ends are going to stay the top QB and tight ends. The receivers, I don't know. So let me go ahead and try this. And I don't think it's going to be something that a lot of people are trying. So that was my initial thought of drafting this roster. Now, I didn't do this on, a ton of rosters, right? This was something where I wanted to work in some like these in the right positions to do it. And the other part I would say to people is, even if you have a thought, like I want to work in a roster like this, never go into a draft being like, this is going to be the one where I do it. Always go into the draft being like, I'm going to do it when it makes sense and where I'm in the right spot to do it. And so this was that one for me. And so when I came through this draft, right, I say, okay, I'm going to take, Bijan, in the first round. All right, whatever. He's the first round pick. You just kind of want flat exposure. And then I get to the second round. I'm like, okay, well, Jonathan Taylor is here, and he's a couple of picks around his ADP, but sometimes he goes, already at this point. So, all right, let's see. If I take him, can I do this? So I take him, and then I'm like, all right, I kind of want to make this into that roster if I can. And my favorite, tight end and quarterback stack is Mahomes and Kels this year because I think it's undervalued. I think there's a recency bias going on with quarterbacks and tight ends where last year was basically the worst year to try to load up on elite quarterbacks and tight ends because you had Laporta, come out of nowhere. You had Kels underperform. You had a lot of QBs that were middling type QBs perform around the top 5 last year. Mahomes underperformed. So everybody, because we know that's going to happen again this year, is devaluing tight ends and quarterbacks. So it's pretty easy to get that pairing. But you can see by ADP here, and this, even though this was an early draft, I was still overdrafting Kels in the 3rd round there at pick 31. His ADP was never that high. But I knew what I was trying to do here. And then I pair him with Mahomes right away. Again, I was drafting Mahomes a little bit above his ADP even at this point because I wanted to get that pairing. So now I have the initial foundation of what I wanted to do, right? My first 4 picks are 2 running backs, a quarterback, and a tight end. So I lose, but I'm still going to keep drafting. And at this point, I said, all right, now I know that my roster is going to be relatively unique, and I really need to attack wide receiver. And so from this point forward, I basically just drafted all wide receiver. Like I think I drafted 6 or 7 wide receivers in a row. And I got a little bit lucky on this roster, but I also took advantage of ADP. So I drafted Hollywood Brown, who now looks like in a little bit of an ADP deal there. But at the time, he was actually, I think around pick 60 or 61.
Yeah, 60, a little bit later than that.
A little bit later than that. Calvin Ridley looks like a little bit of it looks like a decent ADP deal there now. But at the time, he was going around pick 70. So that was pretty actually normal-ish, maybe just a little bit behind where he was going. Odunze, again, looks like a pretty good ADP deal now. But again, at the time, while that was still beating ADP by a little bit at the time, it wasn't drastic. He was also going around pick, I think like 70-ish. Christian Watson, who I had touted maybe a day before on our podcast together, at the time, he was going around pick 90. That wasn't even an ADP really win at the time. That was just normal. The guy who really fell to me on this roster was Deontay Johnson, who fell all the way to pick like 100-ish. And again, that was an ADP deal at the time, but he was going more around in the 80s. So it wasn't as extreme as it looks now. And then Lockett, who looks like a good ADP deal now too. At the time, he was going at 115 to 112. That really wasn't even an ADP deal there. And so when you look at those wide receivers, if you look at how many of them are currently going in the first 84 picks, right? I actually got 5 wide receivers on this team, not even 4, that are currently in the first 7 rounds. And if you look at Lockett, who is just right behind there, to draft these wide receivers now, even though I don't have any of the really top end guys, it would be basically impossible. You'd have to dedicate, all of your first 7 round picks to wide receivers. And that's interesting because this roster has 2 stud running backs and a stud QB and a stud tight end on it. So if these wide receivers end up being anywhere near what their ADP is now evolving into, this has a chance to be a pretty strong roster. And then the other factors that I tried to put in here were, one, Aaron Rodgers, whose ADP now looks pretty normal. That was actually a deal at the time. He was a little bit higher at the time.
Yeah.
And Mike Williams, whose ADP now looks more normalish, that was actually a deal at the time. He was about 105 to 110 at the time too. So I was able to pair the Jets along with the rookie slot guy as well there and get a double stack on the Jets, a double stack on the Chiefs. I even got Conklin in there for the tight end to try to pair tight ends and quarterbacks, which I love to do because of the touchdown correlation. And then for running backs, I basically said, look, I have 2 studs on this team. For this team to do well, those 2 guys have to perform in the top 5 at RB, which they both can do. So why do I want to draft more than 4 running backs on this team? If those guys are both top 5 running backs, how many weeks am I really going to get out of any other running backs that I'm drafting on this team? So the only reasons that I drafted Corum and Wright were really, and Corum ends up looking like a great ADP deal. I was on him early just because Rams offense and I'm not on Williams. But the reason I drafted Corum and Wright was because I'm very underweight on Williams and Shane, who I just think are being overdrafted and have been overdrafted all season long. And I just don't understand their ADPs maybe more than any other 2 players. So I am going to take their backups as much as I can, basically, because again, if I'm right that those guys don't perform or get hurt, then the backups probably will, because they are good offenses and they are good running games. So that's the idea behind taking those 2 guys. So basically saying I'm going to take 2 studs. I'm going to count on them to be my 2 weekly guys. I'm going to take 2 guys who, if the top guys fail, they'll benefit. And then have an elite QB and elite tight end, and really 5 wide receivers that are now meeting the meta. And so I think this is an example of a way to kind of get away from the meta, but still achieve a strong roster.
I love all of that. And I think we can't continue past this roster without first highlighting what is probably going to be brought up when people see this roster initially. And that is like, there is almost 0 week 17 correlation on it. I think the only piece that you have is a secondary between Odunze and Lockett. So talk to me about, like, does that matter? Or talk to me about like what you're thinking on the clock here.
So I think I drafted this roster before the schedule release.
Okay.
So I didn't know.
Gotcha. All right.
So that's the reason.
But I have some thoughts. Even if this roster were drafted after we had the schedule, we have to realize that we have to understand EV. We have to understand variance, because they are both contributors to what we're doing here, but they are basically, one does not include the other. So like EV assumes, or it removes variance, because we can't quantify variance, right? EV also assumes an infinite sample. We've talked about this before. And variance is in everything that we're doing here. So when we're trying to like control and manage both of those, we have to first like understand each individually, right? Because then we can like combine them, combine forces and move forward with the major contributors to what we're doing here in best ball. So because EV assumes or removes variance, because it assumes an infinite sample, that's like step one. We know we don't have an infinite sample. We know that this is a sample size of 1. But furthermore, EV includes so many different pieces to that puzzle. EV is an equation. And when you have the inputs, when you understand the inputs, it goes a lot deeper than just week 17 correlation, roster construction, a closing line value versus ADP. There's so much that goes into the calculation for expected value that we can't like even comprehend what is going on behind the scenes. And EV equation is going to change with each subsequent pick in a draft, as in the inputs are going to be weighted differently in that calculation. So that's a lot of like nerdery and theoretical mumbo jumbo to say we don't know, we cannot calculate what's more important to a roster. Is it closing line value versus ADP? And is it like team stacks? Is it correlation for week 17 and week 16? All we know is all that stuff goes into EV calculations. We also don't know what's more important in round 6 versus what's more important in round 17 and 18. Are those variables going to be weighted similarly? They're not. So like we don't know at what point closing line value becomes more important than team correlation, team stacking. All we know is like closing line value or like a value in the 6th round is not infinitely, but a lot more important than closing line value or a value in the 17th, 18th round. So like this game that we're playing is far from linear. Like we don't have these answers, but we have like a starting point. We know that like 2583 build and 3582 build is our starting point on Underdog. We know that like closing line value is important. We know that like correlation for week 17 and week 16 are important because week 17 is the primary contributor to EV in these contests in playoff style. We know that week roster construction is, and it contributes most heavily to advancement rate, which advancement rate is the second highest contributor to EV. And then behind that is week 6. So like my point here is like, yes, all of that stuff is important. We need to be thinking about week 17 correlation. We need to be thinking about closing line value versus ADP. We need to be thinking about roster construction. We need to be thinking about team stacks. But we don't know like how much weight each of those things gives us to EV yet. So like, yeah, this roster doesn't have a lot of week 17 correlation. That does not mean that you're doomed in week 17. You cannot win. Like that we don't really know. So yeah, I just thought that kind of discussion had to be had here with this particular roster because like there is so much closing line value versus ADP, and there's so much to talk about as far as roster construction goes, positional allocation, team stacks, but it's missing that like, or quote unquote missing, that week 17 correlation piece. So I thought that was interesting. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it was pre-schedule release, so I just didn't know. That's the main reason there's not more of an effort to do that. I do think week 17 correlation is important. I got kind of lucky with Theo Dunze and Lockett receiver correlation there. But, it's also not the be-all, end-all of everything. Yeah. I think that something people don't weigh enough is just like a certain team's schedule for weeks 15, 16, and 17. And I can give you an example of a team that I like their schedule for those weeks is the Texans. And I don't really hear anybody talk about the Texans. And mostly when I do hear people talk about the Texans, I hear them talk negatively about the Texans because they say, well, they have 3 receivers going in the first, 4 or 5 rounds. And so they can't all, produce that type. You're right. Probably not. But does anybody remember the 50 touchdown Peyton Manning Denver Broncos where all 3 of them, I think it was Stokely and I forget who else he had there. They all caught 10 touchdowns. So it's not impossible, but I agree. It is not the most probable outcome, but could 2 out of 3 of them produce? I mean, could Diggs and Collins both have top 10 years, which we've seen out of receiver pairs many times in relatively recent years. I think CJ Stroud is the real deal. So I have a lot of different stacks where I'm taking Stroud, Collins, and Diggs and pairing them in different ways. And yes, I try to do like Mark Andrews on those teams. But really what I'm looking at is they play the Dolphins in week 15. They play the Chiefs in week 16. And then they play the Ravens in week 17 at home. And yeah, is the week 17 matchup in and of itself against the Ravens necessarily like, oh my gosh, I really want to get a team playing the Ravens in week 17? Like, not necessarily, but the week 15 matchup against the Dolphins and the week 16 matchup against the Chiefs could absolutely be track meets. And if those two are track meets and you get a lot of rosters through, or even one roster through with, the Texans stacks, don't think they can't hurt the Ravens in a 1-game sample size at home in week 17, because they can. And the Ravens are traditionally an aggressive defense. And so, I'm not going to I think a lot of people look at something like that and they think like, it's a bad week 17 matchup. Like, they're playing the Ravens, I'm going to go a different direction. And that's a mistake. You should be looking all 3 weeks. You should be seeing what team schedules you like all 3 weeks. And you know what? Maybe if you think the Ravens is a bad week 17 matchup, then correlate your backup QB with somebody else that you think is a better week 17 matchup. And then try to have the week 15 and 16 games against the Dolphins and Chiefs get you there. And then maybe your backup QB wins you a bunch of money in week 17. So I think sometimes people use week 17 correlations a little bit too strictly overall.
Yeah, and we saw that last year with the Jets and Browns game. People were talking about, we have to stay away from this game because it's played on a Thursday in week 17. We know that historically scoring across the league on Thursday is lower than like the median scoring on Thursday is lower than Sunday, Monday games. My response to that is that neglects range of outcomes discussion. And that'll actually lead us directly into the discussion on some of the wide receivers for Houston is a good example. Another team is the Jets probably this year, with 2 players being drafted inside the top, 13 picks now, or 12, 11, wherever. Garrett's like right at the end of the first round. Another team that we could say the same thing about, what else is there? The Dolphins. The 49ers is a good one. That is why I want to talk about that is we see a lot of talk on the interwebs, even from talking heads in the industry, about, hey, like, in what world does Brandon Ayuk do Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel pay off their ADP? Well, it's like they're unlikely to both. Their median outcome is unlikely to both justify their current ADP, right? But that's like, how are ADP, like, what do we have to measure a success of a player, individual, this season? We compare it and I say we, the industry, we compare where they finished from a season-long standpoint to their ADP that we drafted them at. And it's like, they beat ADP. Their season-long ending beat ADP. That they were a win at ADP where they were being drafted. Well, it's like, maybe not. This isn't a season-long game. Like, this is a weekly game that we're playing over 17 times with the same roster. So how do we compare? Is it like, how many wide receiver 2 finishes, weekly finishes did they have? How many wide receiver 1 weekly finishes did they have? That is probably a better indicator of like paying off ADP in best ball, as opposed to comparing strictly like season-long finish versus ADP. So like, the point there is, I think we as an industry, and we as in us playing these games, are probably still not valuing single week range of outcomes as high as we should. And I think that's directly pertinent to the discussion of Houston wide receivers. It's highly unlikely that all 3 Houston wide receivers are going to end the season to pay off their current ADP. But can that just not matter? Like, have we seen in the past a team ping pong spike weeks? Yeah, like the 2022 Minnesota Vikings come to mind. Like all three of their primary contributors didn't end the season paying off ADP, but they just ping pong back and forth like spike weeks. I mean, in talking about DFS, we had a rule in 2022 at OWS. It was like always one Viking. One of those guys was highly likely, and we talking about who were we talking about at the time? TJ Hawkinson. We were talking about Justin Jefferson.
Yeah.
We were talking about the backfield. Like one of those guys was highly likely to be on like a winning roster, a GPP winning roster in 2022. And the trick was like figuring out which one. Last season, talking about DFS, we were talking about at 1 week season, always 149er. Like, because it was highly likely that one of those guys was going to end the week on the optimal and or winning roster that week. So like, why can't we draft Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel and George Kittle, who is falling like a madman right now into the 7th round? Why? Like, yeah, they have wide weekly range of outcomes, but they also have wide weekly range of outcomes. Like they're highly likely to return a bunch of spike weeks for us. I think Houston wide receiver room is kind of in that same discussion. I think the Jets primary 2 contributors are in that discussion. Like, yeah, it's highly unlikely that both Garrett Wilson and Brees end the season in the top 12 overall in fantasy. It's unlikely, but we could see this ping-ponging back and forth of these spike weeks where it's like, holy crap, like we have to be accounting for these guys in DFS every single week because one of them is likely to return an elite score. So I think Houston, and I'm going to hear your thoughts on that situation. Like, I think Houston wide receivers might be in that discussion for us this year as well.
Yeah, so I like Houston wide receiver stacks, and I like it with Diggs and Collins, but really any combination of the 3 I think you can do. And if I even have, I think, one team on DK where I took all 3. And yeah, I think number one, I think the Houston offense is going to be very good this year. I think that CJ Stroud is legitimate and he has excellent wide receivers and weapons. And the division that they play in is not very threatening defensively. So I think that Houston is going to be a team that people look back on at the end of the year, kind of like we did with Detroit to some extent last year, and say like, well, that was almost obvious. You know, why am I not, on them more? Like, look at this offense. Of course, this offense produced a ton of points, and so I think again, people are overthinking it a little bit with the like being too smart for their own good. Of, well, they have 3 wide receivers that are all being drafted so high and they can't all hit. I'm going to be smart and just avoid that situation. But what if one of them hits really hard, or what if 2 of them hit really hard? And you just don't have any of them because you were like, well, I'm going to avoid all 3. In best ball, it's different than like a yearly league. Like in a yearly league, I wouldn't be as high on them because I would think to myself like, well, I don't get the best score. I have to actually pick the right one every week, and that's going to be perilous. So trying to draft all these draft capital into Houston receivers in a yearly league and then pick the right one every week, I don't really want to have to do that. But in a best ball league, I mean, as long as I feel confident the offense is going to be good, which I do, somebody's getting it. And so, I don't mind in best ball drafting. Like, I have a lot of rosters where I have Stroud, Collins, Diggs, and Schultz. And it's like, okay, well, a lot of weeks, one of those 3 guys is going to have a good game if I think the offense is going to be good, which I do. And so some weeks, 2 of them are going to have a good game. And if I think the offense is going to be good, I think Stroud is going to have a lot of good games. So why not do that? Why avoid that just because I'm saying like, oh, well, all 3 can't pay off their ADP. First of all, like I used the 50 touchdown Peyton Manning Denver Broncos. You don't know all 3 can't for sure. It's not a guarantee. It's just unlikely.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it is that what if 2 have great years? What if 1 has a great year? If you think the offense is going to be good, somebody is having a good year, unless you really think it's just all going to be perfectly spread out. And so I don't think that that's how it's going to be. So I like the Texans offense. I really do think that especially like Diggs now that he's falling into the 30s in ADP, I think he's a good pick. I'm going to have a good bit of them, honestly. And again, I like their playoffs. I like their week 15, 16 matchups. And I'm not really scared off by I think they have the nighttime Christmas Day game too. So it's even more of a reason to be scared, right?
Yeah.
like flee. I don't know, man. Like
Wednesday games, come on, NFL.
Yeah, I mean, but what if you use the logic of like, hey, the NFL wants to take over Christmas. Like this is their first time ever trying to like say assert themselves on Christmas. Like what if they want to juice up the scoring a little bit in those games? What if the refs get a little flag happy in those games, move the offenses a little bit? Look, you can make that argument too, right? So I think people just they automatically assume they're gonna know what happens. It's a Wednesday game, it's Christmas Day, that means it's gonna be 0-0. I think that's really trying to be too smart for your own good, trying to think too far ahead for your own good.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen a lot of talk about the Wednesday schedule this year, about avoiding that in week 17. We saw it was like the talk of the town last season. Oh, you can't stack Thursday night football in week 17 because scoring, man, they're not going to score. And then like what happened for it to get that way? Like both teams were playing backup quarterbacks. We had like a whole slew of shit happen. It's like, yeah, we can't control any of that, man. But all right, that's variance discussion for a different day. Any other? Well, before I continue, I've left it up there on the screen because obviously TJ Hawkinson was not playing with Minnesota in 2022. Thank you, Mr. Michael. It was Jefferson, Thielen, and Cook that we were ping-ponging in DFS that year. Any saved rounds or any by the ways, looking at this roster before we continue talking about some other stuff?
No, I mean, I think I covered what I wanted to talk about on it and just kind of show the OWS family that there is a different way to go about things than just purely the meta,
Yes, 100%. Before we continue, I got to throw this down on the screen. Obviously, or not obviously, if you are new to Drafters, use code OWS when you're depositing for the first time. You're going to get 100% match deposit bonus on your first deposit up to $100. So we look at some of the contests they have over there on Drafters. The $2, dude, that's 50 free entries in that bad boy. The $15, you can squeeze 9 and a little bit out of that bonus. So head on over to Drafters, use code OWS, 100% match deposit up to $100 on your first deposit. Also, before we continue, and I want to call out one of our not partner, not sister companies, but another company that is doing some great work in this industry right now is Fantasy Points. Yes, I'm writing over there as well, but they have some insane contributors that are doing some awesome work. I think Ryan Heath just put out an article today where he's still inventing new new metrics. I think what was he using today? I forget what he was using, but sorry, this is the worst fucking promo in the history of promos. But over at Fantasy Points, man, they're dropping some insane work. Ryan Heath, Scott Barrett, too many guys to list over there that are doing some awesome work. So head on over to Fantasy Points, check out what they do, check out my work over there, and get signed up for their data suite as well, which is top notch. I've been messing around with that as well. Dude, I'm gonna pass the wheel to you. What do you want to talk about over the next 20 minutes?
I got a couple things here. As I'm like a newscaster, I look down at my notes on my lap. One thing I know that a lot of people are talking about in the industry are tools, like using tools, whatever that really means in best ball.
Real-time assist is the buzzword right now.
Yeah, right. I guess so. Okay. So I mean, as far as that goes, I know like some people are probably worried about that type of thing. I'm not at all. I bring it. I think it's honestly kind of silly to think that there are tools that can even predict best ball right now, or if maybe there will ever be able to. And I'm a person who plays DFS at very high stakes and does it in a way where I make 20 lineups by hand and enter them into 20 maxes and below in the Millie Maker and stuff, but mostly 20 maxes and below. And so I don't use tools even in DFS. And I realize that in DFS, they're very useful and that, most people that are entering 150 lineups are using them. And if I was going to enter 150 lineups in the Millie Maker, I probably would be forced to use them as well. But people are still using those tools in DFS where they're actually useful because there's a lot of math involved with the money that you're spending on players and how you can correlate those things. And so they're much more useful in that setting, I think, than best ball. And I don't use them there. I say bring it there. And, I do just fine there. So for people to come into best ball and think that somebody is going to just have this overwhelming advantage because they're using real-time assist over them, I don't. I mean, any tool that you're using in a best ball setting has to be based on your yearly projection for a player. Like, it just has to be. And so what if those are wrong? And then the other part of it too is like, there's just so much subtlety that goes into drafting a best ball roster. Like, every single draft is different. If you think about DFS, we're always starting at the same set point of here's what everybody costs. Here's the roster construction. It's like chess, right? Like, computers can almost solve chess because it starts from a set point. But you have absolutely no idea what the ADP in that draft that you're doing is going to be. So even if you try to say like, oh, ADP is like a set point, first of all, ADP changes. So, you never change the starting position in chess unless you're playing Fisher Random, which is like a made up game. So you're never going to like change the starting position. So a computer can figure it out. But the ADP is going to change every single draft that you do. And you're going to sometimes see people fall by 20, 30 picks just because people in that draft don't like that player, or just because people in that draft think about injuries in a different way than people in other drafts think about. So, if you want to use a tool, I don't even know what you're doing. It's not even like poker, really. Like, what are you going to do? Like, look at my like Jaleel McLaughlin draft percentage. Like, is it just going to show you like, this guy's drafted this guy 30% of the time? Like, okay, cool. I'll send you a screenshot. Good luck. I'm just so not afraid of that. That to me, it's just like, bring it if you want to try to do that. And in fact, some ways, like, I think it might even make you worse. Because instead of really using your brain, which I think is so important in these drafts and why I like these so much, because you have to pay attention and you have to adjust on the fly. It's not really like DFS, where I have some friends that play DFS where they'll come over and they have not made a single roster and it's 12:30 and they're like, okay, I'm just going to spit these out of a, lineup generator and throw them in, and they can still do well. This isn't like that, where you actually really have to think and dedicate time and experience and hundreds of hours of drafts. And so, to me, it's not really a good game to use those types of tools on. And if you want to go ahead and try, have at it. But I'm not afraid.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the fact that every draft has a different starting point. I talked earlier about how the EV calculation is going to change with each pick, each round, dependent on what's been drafted before you, dependent on your positional allocation, all those things. Like, we don't have the computing power to do that right now. So like, what these tools are and what they're doing is they are helping you with the basics. What we have like come to accept in the industry as like table stakes, as like, you have to do this stuff in order to draft profitably. Like, what is that? It's helping you with playoff schedules. It's helping you with week 17 correlation. It's helping you with roster construction. So the newest tools that are out in the market are actually giving recommended picks. And what they're doing is weighing that based on your positional allocation up to a certain point and balancing that with week 17 correlation and balancing that against like what we know to be optimal as far as roster construction goes. The rest of the stuff that I mentioned before in the EV calculation is not there. And they're not like running new calculations based on what's been taken. Like, a true EV calculator in best ball would calculate expected value for picks with every pick in the draft, not just yours, every single pick.
Every pick.
So like, yeah, it's not doing that. So what these tools are effectively doing is just making table stakes more table stakesy, like making what we should all know and accept, and the contributors to expect value, all that stuff, making it so everybody is doing that. So no longer do we have an advantage by just like correlating week 17, by just team stacking, by just drafting 4 wide receivers through the first 7 rounds. Like, that is not an edge anymore. And we saw this like 3-4 years ago with DFS, where it's like when projections started coming out. And now in DFS, we have simulators. So like, knowing football and being good at like clicking a name is no longer an edge in DFS, and it's no longer an edge in best ball. So that's why we're pushing these like theoretical stuff. That's why we're looking at different ways of constructing a roster. That's why we're building 4 running back builds, 3 running back builds. I know, crucify me, Jesus. All these other things, like, we're trying to exploit now a moving target. So the target has moved about what is like industry standard So how do we move forward? How do we generate those exploits? How do we boost expected value moving forward? So I love that you brought that up. I'm in the same vein that, like, if a program was released and this algorithm was able to run real-time EV calculations, okay, now we're in the realm of real-time assist. Now it's, you're not making a decision. Now it's like, okay, the computer is telling me exactly what to do. Until that point, like, sure, use the tools. Like, it's the same thing in poker as like studying ranges. Like, yeah, that's table stakes now. Like, we understand that the field is much better at doing that. So it's how do we take that and like make that an assumption that, like, yeah, we assume the field is going to be doing these things, and now exploit still. Love that discussion. Anything else to say there?
No, I mean, I think people, overestimate the value of that stuff. If it was that easy to win by using it, then everybody would use it and everybody would have the same roster. It's just not that easy to win by doing it. It's, so I think people overestimate that value.
Yeah. I mean, theoretically speaking, if a game is at equilibrium, everybody should be drafting exactly at equilibrium strategy and allowing variance to roll. Like that, that would be, if we had an infinite sample, everybody would just draft the top guy at ADP within those roster construction constraints and allow variance to take over. Like, we're not at equilibrium. We're not there yet. No. So last time you were on, dude, we played a game at the end of the session. Do you have any games for us today?
Oh man, I didn't prepare a game for today.
All right, okay. I wasn't sure. I had to ask though.
I'll give you a player take since I mentioned him though. Is Jaleel McLaughlin, who I said, what do you want to see that I draft that I have him 35% or whatever? Well, I do have
35%.
I do have him 35%. And
nice.
So there it is, guys. You got it. You can beat me now. Just draft him before I do. But I really like him a lot this year. He's going to be the guy who, like I told you, Christian Watson, I told you, Jameson Williams on the last one, that's going to move up in ADP. And I'll tell you why. It's not just, I know people are like, oh yeah, you heard the camp report from that guy that he's the number one in spring or whatever. That's actually really not the reason why. I was already drafting him as far back as the big board. I'm very overweight on him. And I have some Williams too, because I wanted to hedge a little bit like a baby. I should just have 0% Williams because he's gonna probably get cut. But can't do that. But the reason why I'm telling you Jaleel is gonna have a big year is this guy has been disrespected as a player his entire life, and I don't think people really know much about Jaleel.
He's got that dog, dude.
Dude, I'm telling you, he does. He's been disrespected his whole life. I didn't really know anything about him either, obviously. Why would I? Until I get into my kind of research and I'm trying to figure out who is going to be the Broncos' back, because I want Sean Payton's Alvin Kamara, one of these guys is probably going to be in that role, and I want him. And so trying to figure out who's that guy going to be, and that is what led me to look into kind of all of their running backs and their history. I don't think most people know about Jaleel. I certainly didn't. This guy is not much bigger than me. I mean, he's probably 5'9", like 180 pounds. I mean, he is not a big guy, and he is fast. I think he runs like a mid 4.4 40, but he's not like a Shane, like a 4.31 type blazer at that speed. And so this guy, just nobody has ever thought he could play. He was absolutely dominant in high school. Dominant player in high school, got no offers for college, got no college scholarships, had to go to, like D2 type schools, D3 type schools, worked his way up. I don't think people know this. He's the all-time leading rusher in college football history. Did you know that?
I didn't.
The all-time leading one, going back to the 40s and all of the. Jaleel is the number one leading rusher in college football history. He has rushed for more yards in college football than anyone ever. That is wild. And I don't care that a lot of it was at a lower level, because he was running for 400 yards a game. And then he moved up to a higher level and he kept doing it. And guess what?
Yeah.
Even though he was the all-time leading rusher in college football history, he didn't get drafted because he's too small. So then he comes in as an undrafted free agent, and he makes the team because this guy can play, I guess, apparently. And then it takes him all year last year to kind of massage his way into it. He has some of the best advanced metrics of any running back in the league last year. If you look at his yards above expectation, if you look at the yards that he created, if you go Google him and there is a 15-minute cut up that you can find of every single touch that he or target that he had last year. Go watch that. You go watch that, and you watch this guy's vision, and you watch this guy's burst, and you watch all the things you can't see in his frame and in his speed, and you will understand why this guy has the most rushing yards in college football history. This guy is a football player. He is a duck. He has the best, I will say he has the best vision in the league. And the reason nobody knows that is because he's not big. But the reason he rushes for 400 yards a game is because he doesn't miss a hole. I mean, he sees the blocking. He's crafty in the screen game. I mean, when you watch some of these screens, he the way that he sells it before he spins around his, this guy can play football. If he was born in a 6'1", 225-pound body, he'd have been the number 1 overall pick. And his whole life, people have been sleeping on him because he's not very big. And then when those reports come out that he works his butt off, that Sean Payton he's been pressing him, and then you see what they did drafting Estime, right? If I said the last name right. That pick didn't make any sense to me when they made it. I was very confused by it because I was like, you have 3 viable running backs there, right? Like, why would you draft another one when most teams don't even carry 4 running backs into the year? And I was kind of like, all right, something's up here. And I was thinking maybe they're going to cut Jaleel. So let me hedge a little bit on Javonte Williams here. That was stupid. I should have just read the situation as what it is. I think they're going to cut Javonte Williams, not because of that report, because of it makes a lot of sense. He's complaining about his contract. He really hasn't proven himself. He looked bad last year. Yes, he might be better this year because he's 1 more year away from the injury, but he didn't look good last year. They draft Estime, who really looks like he could be the Mark Ingram, right? Who's going to be the Alvin Kamara? It's going to be Jaleel. And I'm telling you, this guy can play. He can play. He's good at football. It doesn't matter that he's not huge. He's good at football. And I think they're going to end up putting him in the Kamara role. I think that they're going to let Perrine and Estime compete for the Ingram role. I think Estime might even win that. So I have teams where I'm drafting Jaleel and Estime on the same team and saying I'm going to get Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram for absolutely nothing. So I am really high on Jaleel. I think he is going to be the guy who, when people look back in next year and they say, oh, this guy is now a second-round pick, I think that's going to be him.
I have 22%. You tell me it needs to go higher?
It's going to go higher for me. I'm at 35%, and he's going to be that guy for me this year that's 50%. But here's the thing. When you don't have all day to do this, sir. You don't have all day to do this because when training camp breaks and more and more reports start to come out that like he's in that Alvin Kamara role and Javonte Williams, they might not make the roster and all that. And then when all of a sudden there's a week left, before the season and they cut Javonte Williams and it's like, whoa, the surprise training camp cut. Oh God. And then, the last, week of draft season, it's going to be like Jaleel's getting drafted like 60th. I really think that's going to happen, in my opinion. And so I'm getting I want him in every draft. I'll overdraft him by 15 picks, if I feel like I have to based on ADP to get him. But I want him in every draft.
All right, man, that was fire. Give me another one. You got another one?
Yeah, I got plenty of them. So I think that I already mentioned I'm not high on Ashane and Williams, Kyron Williams, because I just think they're inflated from recency bias and last year, and I think that Corum and Wright or Mostert could really factor in. So those guys, but I'm not going to dwell on those. I just want to mention them. Quentin Johnson is another one who I think could move up substantially. The Chargers wide receiver. And
all right, that's all the time we have. All right, we'll see you next time. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, I think he could move up significantly, and it's not even necessarily because I think as highly of him as I do of Jaleel as a player. It's more of just like there's a ton of uncertainty there, and I don't know why Palmer is going 30, 35 picks higher than Johnson. Like, to me, Johnson is the one with the upside. Like, he could totally not work out, but he's going around pick 150. And so I think it's worth it there for a guy who could be the wide receiver 1 in a decent offense if they get the running game going. And if, Herbert is still good. The other thing too about the Chargers offense is that people are treating it as if like they're going to do nothing but run. And they're probably going to run more, but the offense was built to pass for the last 3 years, and you can't just change the personnel overnight. So at the end of the day, they want to score points. And so if they come out and the running game just isn't super effective, like, do you really think they're going to slam Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins into like a brick wall? Yeah, it's not as if they have like a superstar running back either to just make it work. Like, they have some subpar running backs. Maybe Vidal is better than, ends up being good, but it's like they don't have any running back on paper right now where you're like, oh, this guy's just going to make it happen himself. So what if their running game just isn't very good? Then like, what are they going to do? Just lose? Like, no, they're going to throw.
Yeah.
And Herbert, I still believe Herbert is a pretty good quarterback. Like, I don't know if he's top 5, but he's probably top 10. I still think he's pretty good. And so, who's he going to throw to? McConkey is a rookie and looks like he's going to profile as like a slot guy. Palmer is an all right player, but like, who really thinks Palmer is like a wide receiver 1 archetype? Like, he's going to really be that guy. I don't see that from him. And then there's Quentin Johnson, who they really drafted to be that guy. I mean, he was a first round pick. He has the physical tool set. Yeah, he stunk last year. He was not very good last year. But are there guys who figure it out after a year? Like, yeah, there are. And a lot of it's about opportunity. Quentin Johnson was nowhere near the guy last year, like not even close. Yes, he got a lot of playing time and he stunk, but he could improve this year. And I just see him as the guy who has that wide receiver 1 profile of like, if he figures it out, if he improves, he could be a wide receiver 1. And if Camp comes in and it's like, oh, Quentin Johnson is going to start, like he's looking like he's going to be the first round pick that they thought he was, he's going to move up, maybe all the way to the cutoff at pick 84. So I just think he's another guy who could move up.
I think with the Chargers in particular, it depends a lot on the health of their defense too, because like on paper, they have a pretty solid defense. I mean, there's some recognizable names here: Poona Ford, Joey Bosa, Denzel Perryman, Khalil Mack. They got Asante Samuel, Derwin James. Like, the list kind of goes on. If those guys remain healthy, then they might be allowed to kind of run the offense that they want a little bit deeper into games, because their defense is really there holding them in the game. But we've seen in very recent history, like, that's all fine and fun until you get punched in the mouth, right? Until players start going down, they pick up some injuries on the defense. They're going to have to throw more as well as a result of that. So, again, lots of variance. People don't think in those terms of like, their defense is great, they're just going to run the football. But what if, like, that variance is very real?
You want to target uncertain situations with late picks. And that's what we saw, with the Rams last year. Unfortunately, you had people like me who were all over Zach Evans. Joke's on me. But, like, you want to target uncertain situations. That's where guys emerge that, are going to outproduce their ADP by a big margin, are just uncertain situations. And it might not be Johnson. It might be Ladd. It might be Palmer. It might be Shark.
Yeah.
It might be Brendan Rice. Like, we don't know who is going to really emerge in that wide receiver room, but we do know whoever is the most productive receiver on the Chargers is probably undervalued in their ADP right now.
Concur, man. We're going to end it there. Try to keep these to an hour as much as we can. I don't know. Do you feel like content gets a little bit harder to digest if it's longer than an hour?
Yeah, like an hour. It's a good, nice.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to end it there, man. As always, if you're not following Papy, go follow him. His Twitter, that's actually his Twitter link in the bio right there in this little picture, at Papy324. Papy is one of the primary contributors at OWS, writes up some edge games as well for us there, and just a pretty solid, brilliant best ball mind. So I love having you on, Papy. Thanks for coming on again. Again, before we head out, head on over to oneweekseason.com. Get signed up for Best Ball Plus now. You have a reduced price, so little discount at the door there. $159 for the rest of the off season, and you get access to everything that we have done up to this point as well. So, and always remember, always a Viking on every team there. Yeah, that might be dated, but yeah. All right, y'all. Until next time, you know where to find us. Head on over to oneweekseason.com. He's Papy. I'm Hilow. We'll see you.
1 week season.